like to reflect your plea?
Your Honor, on behalf of Mrs. Daybell, she enters a not guilty plea to both charges and the request for a pretrial and a jury trial.
Well, there you have it. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell will be sitting in a courtroom together. Their cases have been officially joined, their trials combined. You heard the arguments from the defense attorney, John Pryor, who's representing Chad Daybell. You heard the arguments from Rob Wood, who's representing the state. The judge weighed those different factors and ultimately said that there's just too much weighing here, that there are too many concerns. COVID was brought into this, the identical nature of the charges. And I want to get some perspective on this because there is a lot to break down with this new outcome. So joining me, I have an all-star panel, is Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. I'm also joined by forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan, and of course, crime analyst, former SWAT team member Lisa Lockwood. Wow. Okay, so Julie, let me start with you. This was major. Now we're going to see them both in a courtroom, unless, of course, as we heard from the judge, there's always an opportunity for the defense later on to say, look, this is very prejudicial. We want to move to sever the trial. So that could ultimately happen. But right now, both these parties, this couple, is going to be joined together. They're going to be tried together. Your thoughts?
So I don't think anyone was incredibly surprised by the judge's ruling. I don't think there was any basis that the defense was going to come up with, at least at this point, in order to keep them, as we say, unjoined. And the reason is because not only is it a crime that they're working together, it's conspiracy. So the acts of each of them are relevant in terms of proving the conspiracy. I think the one argument that the defense had was that it's going to unduly prejudice him because it's going to be even more publicity. I guess he thinks that Lori Daybell has more publicity than he does. But that is not an argument that's going to sway a judge, particularly when we're dealing with a conspiracy case.
Lisa, the problem with this, though, is the investigation into this whole saga is a nightmare. It's incredibly complex. Having said that, though, it seems the investigation into Chad Daybell and what role he had in the deaths of these children could be arguably different than Lori Vallow Daybell. Remember, the kids were found on his property. That already sets up a little bit of a difference in their cases. So as you have investigators, and a lot of this is being kept close to the chest, we still don't know all the details. Investigating Chad, investigating Lori, there does seem to be a difference here. What do you think, Lisa?
Yes, there is. And what we found out today with the geolocation of finding the fact that the bodies were on site when he was texting, I'm sorry, not the bodies were on site, the fact that he was at his home when the bodies were there. So timing of that with his communication with his alive wife, Daybell, completely different than Lori's involvement. It doesn't put her there on the scene. So yes, the evidence will be different in that particular issue.
Now, Joseph, we still don't know exactly what happened, the cause of death of Tylee or Joshua. Those autopsy results have not been released. We know their bodies were found, and in different ways. It seems that Tylee's body was dismembered or attempted to be dismembered and burned. The fact that we don't know more details, we don't know the cause of death yet, and the fact that neither Lori nor Chad has currently been charged with murder, the fact that we don't know this at this point in the case, what do you think about that?
I think that it presents an interesting scenario moving forward, and I keep waiting for some kind of trigger mechanism to kind of kick in. I've thought about this a lot and covering this case for all of these months now, and I don't want to necessarily connect these two specifically, but I have to. I still want to know why Tammy Daybell died. I don't understand that, and I'm wondering if we're waiting for maybe some kind of mechanism to kick in when they come forward with this information. You're right. They have yet to give us a specific cause of death for either one of these children. We certainly don't have it for Tammy. But, as for Tammy, she's that investigation relative to her is something completely separate. And I don't know, they haven't stated that it's an actual investigation because per the coroner there in Rexburg, she was ruled as a natural death. Why are they withholding that information? That's the big key for me. And
Well,
so I'm going to be very
and we
anxious to
can't
hear this.
and we can't forget her body was exhumed and then an
Yes.
autopsy performed. Those results, again, we don't know yet. Now, again, when we're talking about Tammy Daybell, this was the former wife of Chad Daybell who died, and then it was only a short time after, a few weeks later, that he ended up being together with Lori Vallow Daybell. Now, Julie, before we hit our break, I want to ask you this. We didn't see Lori Vallow today. We didn't see her attorney, Mark Means, because they did not object to the state's motion to join the cases. Now, I have to ask you what that was about. My personal theory is that Chad Daybell's attorney, Lori Vallow Daybell's attorney, came together and said, hey, listen, remember, they're represented by the same law firm here, and say, hey, listen, if we want to show how different our cases is, how different our strategies are, how we're going to fight this in a different way, why don't you object? Why don't I not object? And that'll show, look how different these cases are. They can't be combined. That's my personal theory. Explain to me what you think the theory is on your part, why Lori Vallow didn't object to the joinder today.
That's an interesting theory, and it troubles a lot of people that that two individuals from the same firm are handling both cases, because there's a built-in conflict of interest when it comes to each of those defendants. I have a different theory. The theory I have is that the case against Chad Daybell is arguably stronger. And so if you put them next to each other, a jury may sit there and say, I think the case against Lori's there, but I think the case against Chad is more powerful. And that may impact their ability to find her guilty versus him. Just a theory.
It's a theory, and that's what we've been doing in this case, trying to understand what's happening. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about what happened today, and maybe more importantly, what is going to happen in the future. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. If you're just joining us, huge development in the Lori Vallow Daybell saga. We have learned from a hearing today, the judge overseeing the case has officially combined the trials of Lori Vallow Daybell and her husband, Chad Daybell. That means they're going to be tried together. This is massive. Now, I'm going to go back to Rob Wood, the prosecutor, the person who's representing the state in this matter, the person who was actually petitioning the court to combine these trials. Listen to some of his arguments from earlier today.
A court decides if two defendants should be charged and tried together or if joinder is appropriate. Rule 8b states that it's appropriate for two defendants to be charged together if they are alleged to have participated in the same act or transaction or in the same series of acts or transactions constituting an offense or offenses. It also establishes that each defendant does not need to have identical charges to do so. Rule 13 gives the court the authority to order that two or more complaints, indictments, or informations be tried together if the offenses and defendants, if there is more than one, could have been joined in a single complaint, indictment, or information. In the case before the court, Chad and Lori Daybell are both charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to conceal, alter, or destroy evidence. Chad Daybell is additionally charged with 2 counts of concealing, altering, or destroying evidence. The evidence in question for all counts is essentially the same. That evidence is the deceased bodies of Lori Daybell's children, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. Both of the deceased children were found on Chad Daybell's property in Fremont County, Idaho. They were found after law enforcement discovered a text from Chad Daybell to his now deceased wife, Tammy, matching that text with geolocation data from the phone of Lori Daybell's now deceased brother, Alex Cox, gave law enforcement the location of the children's bodies. The Daybells are charged with conspiracy because the evidence which the state will present shows that there was a plan between the defendants in regards to the fate of Lori Daybell's children. The evidence in this case, the state believes, will demonstrate that the concealment of Tylee and JJ's bodies are the result of the same plan and the same series of acts or transactions which constitute the offense for which both defendants are charged. And that is the standard set forth in Rule 8b. As mentioned in the state's brief in Zafiro versus the United States, the Supreme Court stated that joint trials play a vital role in the criminal justice system, that they promote efficiency, serve the interest of justice by avoiding the scandal and inequity of inconsistent verdicts. Currently, the defendant's cases are assigned to 2 different judges. This is highly inefficient as it requires duplicative work from 2 judges, their clerks, and their staff. It requires the state to perform duplicative work by creating a need to litigate similar issues twice in front of 2 different courts. This raises one of the most important issues in front of the court, as in most criminal cases, issues of evidence will be litigated prior to trial in these cases. It's inevitable. The trial court has varying degrees of discretion over the admissibility of evidence. As these cases are currently situated, it's entirely possible that an issue of evidence could be decided upon differently by 2 different courts. The state believes that could create automatic issues of appeal if that decision is beneficial to one defendant and yet harmful to another defendant.
And those were some important arguments that the judge in this case ultimately believed and felt that that is the reason why these cases should be combined together. Now, Lisa, I want to go to you. This, as we talked about, is a complex investigation, and it seems that Rob Wood may be directing his moves based on what we don't know. So again, as we talked about earlier, we don't know the particular cause of death of the kids. We know that if you go back to Arizona, the death of Lori Vallow's former husband, Charles Vallow, being investigated because it was indicated several months ago that she may be brought up on conspiracy to commit murder charges. He, of course, was shot by Alex Cox, who was Lori Vallow's now deceased brother. So the idea that there are these other kinds of investigations going on, there's that in Arizona, there's the investigation into the death of Tammy Daybell, Chad Daybell's former wife, died under suspicious circumstances. How are these other investigations playing into the current upcoming trial, not trials, trial of Lori and Chad?
You would hope there'd be no bias based on that because there are no charges right now. But everybody's aware of it. The media is aware of it. The police are aware of it. We know that those investigations are underway. We don't know when they're going to get all the facts that they need regarding it. As Scott said earlier, we're still waiting for an autopsy report after the body was exhumed. We don't have that. The brother who actually shot and killed Chad Daybell, Charles Vallow, her husband at the time, he's now dead of a brain aneurysm, and it was ruled self-defense initially. So in order to investigate any further, the person who actually shot and killed him is now deceased. So going further with that is probably going to be very difficult. I think what they're banking on right now is the possibility when they discover if there's any foul play with Tammy Daybell's death.
Let's talk about what we do know. Joseph, the bodies, the way that they were disposed of, still a question of who disposed them, how they were disposed, and who's responsible ultimately for their deaths. Of course, Alex Cox has been presumed to be responsible for being the murderer in this case. That's a separate question. But what do we know, Joseph, about the way these 2 kids were disposed?
Well, it's kind of interesting, Jesse. With JJ, he died. He was disposed of, rather, in kind of when compared to his sister. Or he was disposed of in kind of a respectful manner, if you will, if there is such a thing. His body was carefully wrapped. His head was covered. Lots and lots of tape. Kind of covering his body. As a matter of fact, there was one piece that I'd read where there was so much tape surrounding his mouth, which is an interesting factor in and of itself, that they had to go with great care in order just to remove that tape. But then you look at Tylee's body. Tylee's body was discarded, if you will, in an area that some people have referred to as kind of a pet cemetery, or immediately adjacent to that, next to an area where you would have a fire ring, but you would also burn debris. There was an attempt, at least, to dismember her. We don't know necessarily to what extent, but Jesse, when I'm looking at this thing, and just from kind of a forensics standpoint and a behavioral standpoint, she was almost disregarded and dehumanized to a great degree. So you've got 2 separate dynamics going on here.
And I want to address that in a second, the difference there. But let's just go back to John Pryor, who earlier today represents Chad Daybell, trying to say that these cases, these trials, should not be joined.
I think in good faith, I can't argue that the allegations, and I want to make it clear that they are allegations against Mr. Daybell and Ms. Vallow, are similar in nature, and that under the prong of 8B, it applies, and the joinder does apply. The objection, Judge, that I filed talks about prejudice. Further, I appreciate that Mr. Wood recognizes that at any time in the future, I can file a motion for severance under 14 and say that trying these two folks in the same proceeding is highly prejudicial. Mr. Wood and I have discussed, and I'm not going to make a matter of this, but there's still some housekeeping that needs to be done in terms of discovery that Mr. Wood and I are going to privately engage in trying to resolve, and if necessary, we'll ask the court's assistance. But at this point, without all of the information in this case, I'm not in a position to argue severance on this date, and that's going to have to be reserved for a different date. But Mr. Wood's argument, Judge, to suggest convenience to the court and expense to the county and the difficulty of witnesses is secondary. And primarily, Judge, the importance is Mr. Daybell going to get a fair opportunity to present his side of the story? And is it going to be able to be presented without any kind of prejudice or bias? Or are they going to infer anything from any other witness or any other defendant or anybody else that does not afford him an opportunity to fairly present his case? And although 8A doesn't specifically address bias, the Nava case talks briefly that there is still a prejudice or a bias, and the court can evaluate that. Now, I understand there's been an inordinate amount of publicity. Mr. Wood has pointed out examples of some of the publicity, and I've pointed out examples, and that's going to be reserved for a different date in November when we talk about venue. But the fact remains, Judge, that by linking the two of these folks together is still going to provide a modicum of prejudice. And although I have to concede that joinder, when you look straight at the rule 8A, that there is an allegation of similar facts in this case. The fact remains is what I would ask the court to do is reserve a ruling on joinder, allow the argument to be made in terms of severance once Mr. Wood and I have resolved our discovery issues, and decide at that point whether or not we're going to proceed in a common trial. I don't think it's an effective argument for Mr. Wood to suggest that he's going to have to make more effort and he's going to have to do duplicative work in two different cases. And I'm sorry that he's going to have to engage in that.
Okay, Julie, I want to talk about that last part here because it kind of caught my ears a little bit. When you talk about the difference in defense here, and we said, well, you know, maybe one of the reasons that my personal idea here was that the idea that Lori Vallow didn't object to the joinder, Chad Daybell did object to the joinder. You have two different defenses, two different defendants, two different cases. They shouldn't be joined together. You had Chad Daybell who says, I have some issues, John Pryor, I have some issues with Rob Wood. I want to resolve them not here, separately, not in front of the media. Some of it concerns discovery. And then you have Mark Means, who represents Lori Vallow, who is taking every opportunity to criticize Rob Wood and the case in the media, Twitter, letters, again, about discovery issues. These two different kinds of defense strategies, what do you make of it?
So I know your argument would be kind of like good cop, bad cop. So it's two, attorneys from the same firm, and one's kind of, they've decided that one takes one role and one takes another. And who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, I think, the argument that this specific defense attorney is making is, by the way, he's not really making an argument. At the end of the day, he's basically conceding that joinder should happen. He really doesn't even speak to the prejudice or why this prejudice would be so egregious that would prevent them from being joined together. What he seems to be arguing is that there will be a time when discovery is in fact received that may impact a future decision. Maybe there's going to be a witness that, blows this case out of the water regarding one or the other defendant, and therefore they might not be able to be joined at that time. Keep in mind one thing. There's an option at the end of the day, if they're joined together in front of one judge, and there's something that only one jury can hear, that the jury on one defendant can hear, they can always opt for two juries hearing the same case. We've done it many times in New York. It's very efficient. It prevents all the things that Mr. Wood is talking about. And that is a potential option if it comes to issues regarding that.
Practical matter, though, in which we heard a little bit from in the courtroom, is it's COVID time. And we imagine even when this trial starts up, we're still going to be dealing with those issues. To have more people listening to it, more people impaneled, could be, just from a practical point of view, a safety issue and a problematic issue. But we'll get to that maybe a little bit later on. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to focus more on what is going to happen next in this case. Big day in the Lori Vallow Daybell saga. We have learned from a hearing earlier today from the judge, Judge Boyce, that both Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell will be tried together. One trial. This is huge. We've been talking about what this could mean, what's going to happen next. Let's just take a step back and go to the judge from earlier today. You're going to hear his rationale for why these two should be tried together.
It's pretty clear that the first prong of whether or not there's a common scheme or plan is supported under Rule 8B for joinder of the offenses in this case. And then looking at whether or not the joint trial of the two defendants would be prejudicial. There was an allegation in the response that was filed that this would create additional publicity, which would prejudice the right of Mr. Daybell to a fair trial if these cases were joined. I've considered that. I've also considered the arguments of the state that having two separate courses run in two different cases with two different judges could result in separate evidentiary rulings. There could be some inconsistencies. There would be duplicative hearings. And I think quite concerning given our circumstances right now under our COVID restrictions and the difficulties we have even getting a jury trial at this point. The prospect of having two separate trials where two separate juries would have to be impaneled to try each case is concerning as well. And so when I look at all the factors and the supporting case law, I don't find that the prejudice at this point has been demonstrated that would be sufficient to prevent me from joining these cases. And so based on the analysis and consideration of the citations also provided by Mr. Wood, and also in due consideration of the new case that was cited by Mr. Pryor, the Nava case, I read through that as well. I do find the facts of that somewhat inapplicable to the issue I've got at hand. That's where a single defendant had a trial involving separate multiple victims, which were put together in a single trial. Here we've got two defendants with a single common scheme or plan that is alleged. And so upon consideration of all that, counsel, I am going to grant the motion to join at this time. As the parties indicated, that doesn't forego the possibility of a future motion for severance if prejudice is demonstrated by the defense in support of that motion.
Okay, let me get some last minute perspectives here. Lisa, over to you. This is a story that keeps on changing. What are you looking out for next in the Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell saga?
Well, I'm hoping more evidence comes through. I'm anticipating that they will get an autopsy report on Tammy Daybell. That may be coming through to fruition prior to the actual trial date. The trial date may be pushed to Lori's date, which was March, which gives them a little bit more time to prepare for this case and probably enough time to get the results from that autopsy.
Joseph, you had mentioned something to me earlier, and it kind of stuck with me. When you talk about the kids, there's a difference in how they were disposed of. And then if you combine that with the deaths of Tammy Daybell, the deaths of Charles Vallow, and the death of Alex Cox, they all seem to be a little different, yet this couple is surrounded by death. That similarity and difference, what do you make of all that?
Yeah, this is not lost on me, Jesse. I've handled a few death investigations in my time, and I got to tell you, I've never been around. It's like being around the angel of death. You've got people dropping dead. One thing I would like to say is that if you're beginning to talk about conspiratorial events here, where people are joining together in a conspiracy. You got a three-legged stool, and one of the legs is missing right now, and that's Alex Cox. And I can see this thing coming a mile away. This guy's going to become a scapegoat in every bit of this, from beginning to end, because he's not there to defend himself. And like Lisa, I am really awaiting the autopsy results of Tammy Daybell, more so than I am the kids, because I want to know what has happened.
Another suspicious death, who, again, happened at a suspicious time. Alex Cox, what role he may play in all of this, since it was his cell phone that pinged and ultimately led authorities to the bodies of these two kids. We will wait and see. Julie, Joseph, Lisa, thank you so much for giving your perspective on this hearing. Everybody else, stay tuned. Back to your regular scheduled programming.